The information and opinions presented in this Arc Energy Ideas podcast are provided for informational purposes only and are subject to the disclaimer link in the show notes.
This is the Arc Energy Ideas podcast with Peter Tertzakian and Jackie Forrest, exploring trends that influence the energy business.
Welcome to the Arc Energy Ideas podcast. I'm Jackie Forrest.
And I'm Peter Tertzakian. Well, welcome back. So, Jackie, do you ever have those mornings like you just wake up jarred with the alarm clock and you just go, oh my God, I just didn't get enough sleep?
Well, normally I'm up before my alarm clock, but I still feel like I didn't have enough sleep.
It's just sort of one of those mornings for me, I got to be honest. Like, I just felt like cashing in my pension and just rolling over and going back to bed, you know?
Yeah.
Well, we're going to talk pensions, aren't we?
We are. We want to talk about pension funds. And, some pensions, they have their stakeholders, the pensioners in many cases, who want them to reduce their emissions. And so especially in Canada, we've got a whole bunch of pension funds that have decided that they're going to use their capital to reduce emissions. And they've made pledges for how they're going to reduce their emissions, how they're going to measure them. And that's really a big thing that's going on right now in the pension world.
So pensions themselves, the employees are not really the emitters, but it's the companies, the stocks and bonds of companies that pension plans own, that some of them have emissions, many of them do, and that the objective of the pension plans is to have a portfolio where the companies are reducing their emissions.
Exactly. And so they're saying for all of it, they call it like financed emissions, but the emissions that are their equity share of all the companies they own, how are they going to be reduced over time? And they're making goals like net zero 2050 and goals that are closer as well.
Right. So the pension plans only want to invest in companies that make pledges to net zero by 2050 or are demonstrating leadership in reducing emissions and other environmental, social governance, ESG.
Yeah, I mean, in some cases they're doing that. In some cases they're still figuring out how they're going to measure it to do that. In some cases they're saying we're going to divert part of our portfolio to really green solutions as a way to help with climate.
Right.
But, there are some problems with this. It could be that to reduce the emissions in your portfolio, you could just divest of high-emitting things and buy like low-emitting things like banks and IT companies.
Right.
But you maybe haven't really contributed to reducing emissions.
Right.
Do you remember when John Graham came on our podcast last month?
CEO of the Canada Pension Plan Investment Board.
Yeah, and he made a really insightful quote, which we actually did put out on social media. We do not focus on reducing financed emissions. We focus on financing emission reductions. Right? Because you could reduce your financed emissions pretty quickly. Just divest of all your high-emitting companies.
Yeah, that's the easiest way to, quote, decarbonize your portfolio of companies is just to say, okay, I'm going to sell my oil and gas companies, I'm going to sell my fertilizer companies and high-emitting steel companies, aviation, so on. And pretty soon all you have, as you say, is a bunch of companies that are service-oriented companies, and you've decarbonized, but you haven't really optimized necessarily your returns for your pensioners.
No, nor have you really changed anything because you just sold those assets. They still exist. They're still emitting CO2.
Right.
You just don't own them.
So, I mean, this is becoming quite a contentious topic in the United States, especially in states like Florida and Texas, where there's sort of a backlash in terms of the oversight of ESG. We're going to talk about Canada, right? Prominently.
Yes, yeah.
And so we're delighted to have a special guest who is an expert in this kind of subject. All the way from Montreal, we are delighted to have Erica Coulombe, who is vice president at Milani, which is an ESG advisory firm for investors. So bonjour and welcome.
Bonjour. Thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here with you guys.
We also have here from Calgary our own Marcus Rock, who is the senior research analyst at Arc Energy Research Institute, one of our own. So welcome, Marcus.
Yeah, thanks, Jackie. Really happy to be on the podcast. I obviously have to listen as part of my job, but I'm a fan as well. So it's great to be on.
Yeah, and Marcus helps us out a lot, even has to do some checking of the podcast. So this time he's on it. So this is exciting. And the reason we invited Marcus is Erica and him both work together on a project around a new thing, which is called Scope 4 emissions. We're going to get into what that is.
Three wasn't enough?
No, we need 4. A warning to our listeners, this is a pretty technical topic and it may not be for everyone. We're going to try to make it high level and easy to understand. But we think it's an important topic, and that's why we wanted to talk about it.
Well, it is because if achieving decarbonization merely by divesting of emitting companies doesn't green the economy, right? And that certainly is an issue. So this whole area of scope 4 is related to providing incentives for pension plans and other financial institutions to invest on the green side of the ledger, which is also not necessarily happening as fast as people would like.
Right. And it helps them understand what their impact is on the green and clean side. It may not be the way we normally measure it, but there is an impact for the climate, for investing in some of these companies that you don't see by looking narrowly at just the scope 1 or 2 emissions, which we'll get into.
So scope 1, 2, 3, I mean, right off the bat, we're into the jargon, right?
Yes,
which is, and we want to demystify the jargon. We've done that in previous podcasts when we've had people who are familiar with carbon emissions and carbon trading and so on, but I think it's worth a review. And our own Marcus here is going to tell us what scope 1 and scope 2 and 3 are before we even get to 4.
Sure. Yeah. So scope 1, 2, 3, a bit of a corporate emissions reporting 101. Scope 1 is really the most narrowly defined emissions. So those are the emissions that your company actually produces in its owned assets. So using the example of an oil and gas producer, if you just draw a bubble over their producing site, it's all of the emissions that come out as they burn fuel, as they flare gas, and as they release methane. Scope 2 is a little broader. It's the emissions that come from the electricity that you're consuming, every emission that was generated in producing that electricity. So if a coal plant or gas plant had to fire to produce that electricity, those fall in your scope 2. And then scope 3 is the broadest category. It's everything else in your value chain. So there's actually 15 different categories. I won't go through them all, but it includes, the emissions generated in the production of the upstream materials that you're purchasing, in transporting your products. And for oil and gas companies in particular, the big one is from when your products are being used. So when the ultimate hydrocarbon, the gasoline or diesel, get consumed in an engine and
combusted, yeah.
And
the emissions, which is where the bulk of the emissions are. So scope 3 is overwhelmingly for oil and gas the largest fraction.
Yeah, it's about 80 to 90% for oil and gas. And even for most other industries, it ends up being one of the biggest categories.
Right. Okay, so that's scope 1, 2, 3 emissions. Let's talk 4. What's 4?
So scope 4 is really looking at how your scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions compare against the actual alternatives in the market. So it's what product are you displacing? And if you are displacing a higher emissions product, all of those emissions savings are your scope 4 emissions. So take the example of a solar farm, for instance. There's scope 3 emissions as you're purchasing your panels. There's scope 1 emissions as you're putting up your facility and you're operating it. But the scope 1 through 3 are fairly small. The scope 4 would be, now that you're producing that power, some natural gas-fired power plant doesn't have to fire. So that's going to turn down. It's going to avoid emissions, and those fall in your scope 4.
All right. Well, we're going to have a whole section on scope 4 in a bit, but I think we should spend a little bit more time on scope 1, 2, and 3, because 1 and 2, I think, is pretty well established. It's either your emissions within your gate, as you said, Marcus, or it's the products that you might be importing where there were emissions that were used to get them to you, whether it be electricity or natural gas. But let's talk a little bit, maybe, Eric, a question for you. Scope 3, I think that's one that maybe isn't as well established, or, if I looked at a lot of public companies, would I see scope 3 emissions reported? And there's some controversy. Some people think that this isn't a valid metric because they say, well, a lot of people would double count these scope 3. So one company may have to say these are their scope 3 emissions. Like, let's use that oil and gas example. Is the scope 3 emissions from burning the oil and gas? That's for the oil and gas company if a consumer burns the emissions. But then for the consumer, that's their scope 1 emissions. So the argument is, well, they're being double or triple counted here, so they're less valid.
Yeah, I'd say it's true that it's one that has a little bit of a stigma around it. It's more difficult to count because there's a lot of uncertainty, because there's so many players involved with scope 3. It's upstream, it's downstream to your own operations. So it's just so much wider. So it's definitely difficult to kind of grapple on it. And you rely a lot on the data of others to be able to know what is your own scope 3. And it's true that there is some double counting because on one side, your procurement parties that are involved in your supply chain, they themselves have scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, and these fall into your own scope 3 emissions. So it's kind of saying that there will be multiple parties targeting the same emissions that we're trying to reduce. But others would also say that it's a good thing that these are being double counted because the solution doesn't just come from one player, in the sense that if we're all just focusing on our own scope 1 and 2 emissions, we may be missing out on where a lot of other emissions are happening. So if we take the example of the oil and gas, and let's add to this a car manufacturer, At the end of the day, the gas being burned in the car that's being used by a driver falls into the scope 3 of both of these organizations. But if both of these actually just focus on their own scope 1s, we would never actually address the emissions coming out of the car during its usage period. So the fact that there's a bit of crossing, I think, helps to avoid these blind spots within where emissions actually happening.
Okay, so 10 years ago, roughly, we were mostly just talking about scope 1, and even measurement of scope 1 was fairly inaccurate. Then we started talking scope 2, and now it's on to 3. Let's just go back and say, have we even reconciled accurate measurement of 1, let alone 2, 3, and all the rest of it?
It's a great question. And I was thinking about that a little bit. I think about maybe 20 years ago when this whole climate conversation started, the thought was that it would be impossible to find a metric to even have comparable understanding of how each organizations are addressing climate change. And then we came with the measurement of scope 1, 2, 3, this carbon equivalent indicator. Now it's been a few years, and I think we're definitely getting better at measuring our scope 1, getting more specific, more precise. And I would say every day we're seeing new technologies coming out in the market that are allowing to get even more specific on these measurements and having accurate data. The same goes for scope 2, I would say, because now it's about the energy that we're consuming. So that we're getting definitely better at measuring and understanding. And scope 3, where it's a little more vague, but we're seeing more and more organizations doing it. In our most recent study where we assessed the ESG disclosure of the TSX, companies listed on the TSX in Canada, we had almost up to 40% of organizations were actually disclosing on scope 3. So although it's challenging, people are trying to address that. And I think it's by trying and getting more comfortable with the data that we will get more accurate and identify where the blind spots are again so that we can get more accurate data.
Now, when it comes to scope 3, I understand that the regulators in the United States are planning to require this. What's the status of this and possible timing? And do you think Canadian public companies, many of them are listed in the US, so I imagine they're going to have to do that. How are people viewing this? There are some people, I think, that are viewing it quite negatively, especially in the case of oil and gas, where you have a very high scope 3 number potentially.
Yeah, so I would say that right now the US have suggested to make scope 3 part of reporting requirements. Given the current situation, we're not sure if this is going to stick through what is actually going to be proposed and what's going to be passed. That being said, there's what's happening in the US, but there's also what's happening globally. So there's these international sustainability standards boards known as the ISSB that are putting out disclosure requirements with everything related to ESG. And these are going to be mandatory disclosure requirements for public companies. And they have said that scope 1 and 2 will be mandatory, and they're definitely planning to include scope 3. We should find out these sort of final standards should be coming out within the next few months. And what we're hearing is that Canada and the US all want to align to that. So this is probably going to be the trickle effect of once they've actually published their disclosure standards, everybody's going to align. And it's what we're hearing in Canada too, is that regulators want to align to the global standards so that it's just simpler.
So Marcus, let's just talk about the Canadian pension funds. What are some of the goals that they have made? I know they're in progress, but what are some of the examples of what they're working on?
Sure. Yeah. As you said, they are in progress, but there is a lot that's out there already. And the Smart Prosperity Institute actually put out a pretty good document on this outlining the goals. So we'll put that in the show notes. But at a high level, there's kind of the difference between the short-term and the long-term goals. In the long term, of the 7 pension funds that they talk about, which are the biggest pension funds in Canada, 6 of them have a net zero goal in the long term. And on those long-term goals, some of them looking at least from scope 1 through 3. Some are limited to 2. But as you start getting more in the short-term goals, the short-term focus is really on the scope 1 and 2 goals. But some of them are pretty ambitious. If you look at the public sector pension fund, or PSP investments, as they're called, has a 20 to 25% reduction goal by 2026. And as you start getting out, some of them have 2030 goals. But suffice it to say that there are some quite ambitious goals out there that are driving a lot of their decision-making internally.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let's come back to the quote we started with from John Graham from Canadian Pension Plan, CPP. His quote on the podcast, "We do not focus on reducing financed emissions. We focus on financing emission reductions." What are your thoughts on that quote? Considering some of these, it looks like most of these are really focused on big reductions in scope 1 and 2, which could imply that you divest of some of those higher emitting companies and you don't necessarily cause their emissions to go down. You just sell them to someone else.
Yeah, I think that certainly is a risk, particularly with the targets that are focused more on scope 1 and 2, is it drives that sort of decision making where you just get out of the high carbon industries and you're not actually focused on the kind of impact that your investments have. A lot of the pension funds do have another bucket called green and transition investment targets, which does sort of address that point where they're trying to allocate certain amounts of capital to these different areas. CPP, so the Canada Pension Plan, which all Canadians are invested in, has a goal to increase investment in green and transition assets from 67 billion currently to at least 130 billion by 2030. So there are institutions that are taking that approach.
All right, well, let's talk about, come to the scope 4 emissions, because another way to look at it is to say, yeah, we're going to be continuing to improve on our scope 1 and 2, and we're going to continue to hold these companies and ask them to reduce their emissions. But we also want to contribute really positively to climate change, and we may want to invest in some really green areas. And we introduced scope 4. Marcus did a great job of describing that so people can really understand the concept more. Maybe a question for you, Erica. Would scope 4 emissions for a company like Tesla be all the gasoline that they've displaced? So for every electric car on the road that they've ever manufactured, all the gasoline that would have been consumed if those had been combustion engine vehicles, is that what scope 4 emissions would be?
Yeah, I think in a more tangible way of thinking of it, yeah, that's how I would picture it. And I would invite Marcus also to comment on this. But I think that's the sort of, it's the easiest way to kind of grapple the concept.
Yeah, and I think that is mostly right. I mean, the way that I would think about it is that you also have to take into account the emissions that Tesla's putting out into the world. So they do have their own value chain emissions. You know, there's batteries that go into the cars that are quite energy intense. There's, you know, they still have to manufacture the vehicle. But the gasoline that they're displacing, kind of net of the emissions they're adding, would be their scope 4.
Okay, would it be fair to say, you said the word net, would it be fair to say that Tesla is a negative emissions company? Because yes, they produce emissions to make all these batteries, but you know those cars are also resulting in a lot less emissions going into the atmosphere from transportation. So could they say that they're negative emissions?
I think it would be fair to say that they are impactful in climate. I would definitely be cautioning against using the sort of language of net zero that has connotations out there in terms of what people actually think of when net zero is said. And generally, it's conceived of as your net zero on your scope 1, 2, and 3 basis. So there are actually no emissions in your value chain. If you have a lot of avoided emissions, it's a really great news story, and it really helps sort of determine where you fit maybe within the energy transition. But actually calling yourself a net zero company is challenging. And we've seen people get in trouble with this in the past and have accusations of greenwashing.
Yeah. And, if you think about scope 3 on Tesla, there certainly is a constituents out there that would argue the upstream emissions of mining and so on is pretty substantial.
Yeah, and that's certainly true. And they are quite far from being a net zero company currently on that scope 1 through 3 basis.
Getting back to the scope 4 and using this example, Erica, is this sort of a way for financial institutions to be able to justify keeping aviation stocks? Because they can say, well, I've got a portfolio of a few airline companies. I need them in my portfolio because I need exposure to travel. And I've got the scope 4 to offset it. So it's not coming down 45% in aviation, but I've got all these credits from my scope 4 investing in a solar panel company. So therefore, in aggregate, I can carry on. Is that partly what this is about?
I would say yes and no. So in the sense that I think what's important to keep in mind with scope 4 is that it's a comparable. It's not an absolute data point unlike scope 1, 2, and 3. And so depending on what your baseline reference is to calculate this delta of emissions, it will influence the result of the scope 4 calculations. So I think that's really important to keep in mind in having these conversations. And therefore, that's why it can't really be seen as an offset or a credit opportunity, because it's an intangible value in a way. And so I think for portfolios that are looking to have these diversity of exposure and demonstrate that their investments may still contribute to climate change, it's more complementary of. So yes, you are exposed to sectors that are more emitting, but at the same time, you're encouraging them to invest in different technologies that can therefore demonstrate reductions. As a way of demonstrating these reductions, you can speak to scope 4. And in parallel, or as a complement of, you can be invested in other sectors that are actually displacing these different emissions as well.
So in summary, you're arguing that the dominant driver of this whole Scope 4 accounting is to encourage financial institutions like pension plans to invest in more, we'll call them green-oriented tech companies.
I think it's to make an informed decision on whether different technologies and different organizations are having the impact that they're claiming around emissions and using that as a way to demonstrate it. Yeah. It's to offset the argument of I'm going to divest from emitting sectors. I'm just going to invest in sectors that are low emitting like tech, and I'm going to call it a day. That's going to be my transition plan. Well, reality is that it's not it. There was a great article a couple of weeks ago, I think in the Globe and Mail, that was about, it was pushback on ESG indices, saying that in reality, some of them were more like tech indices, but charged at a premium because of the word ESG. And I think that highlights really nicely the issue that we're having now with some of these approaches to reducing your finance emissions, is that by just being invested in that one sector that's low emitting, you're not actually contributing to emission reduction and to climate change. So this is where like Scope 4 comes in nicely.
Well, and Marcus, maybe a great example would be we looked at an insulation company, why the Scope 4 might be important in that case.
Sure. Yeah. No, I really like that example because I think it lays out a few of the problems with just looking at Scope 1 and 2. But yeah, so if you look at an insulation manufacturer, the actual process of producing insulation is quite energy intense. You have to melt the glass. There's spinning of the fiberglass insulation. It actually has pretty high Scope 1 and 2 emissions and maybe even higher than an oil and gas company if you're kind of normalizing it on a revenue basis. But the entire purpose of producing this insulation is to go into a consumer's house to prevent heat from leaking out or heat from coming in the summer, and to ultimately reduce the energy consumption and the emissions that are generated as you're trying to climate control a house or a commercial building. And those emission savings actually far outstrip what are generated in the life cycle of producing this insulation. But if you were just to look at your Scope 1 and 2 emissions, you wouldn't capture any of that. You might say that, this investment actually screens really poorly. I'll sell that and I'll buy Facebook. But that's not actually driving any sort of transition to a lower carbon economy.
Yeah, so it just kind of highlights some of those companies that may have high Scope 1 and 2, but are still contributing in a big way to helping the climate problem.
So I think that's a great example. The question I have is, okay, let's take this insulation company and it produces all this insulation that has R value. So who is actually doing the calculations to compute the heat that is kept in a home? You know what I'm saying? Like, that's a complex calculation. Is that what you do, Erica? Or like, who does this? And how do we get a standard for these sorts of things? I mean, these are complex physics type things that have to, I guess, ultimately come into an accounting form.
Yeah, for sure. Well, maybe I can touch on it, and then Erica, if you want to elaborate, because this is sort of the crux of what we've been working on, because it is a really challenging problem, as you say, and there are standards out there that are developing that point to the principles that you should bring to bear when you're thinking about these, but there isn't the same way that there are in Scope 1 and 2 where there's a factor that you multiply by. It's not quite that simple. So you really do have to, sort of dig down and find out what you think the appropriate sort of business as usual case is. What would have happened if you hadn't produced that insulation? And there is, it is to a certain extent a bit more of an art than a science. There's a lot of uncertainty in these calculations, but completely ignoring that wedge of emissions isn't a solution either.
Right.
Yeah, and I would say with time we got more sophisticated with our different calculations with Scope 1, 2, 3. So I think the same is going to happen with Scope 4. I wouldn't be too concerned about that. And who knows, maybe as we get a better understanding of Scope 4, because it seems to be such a case-by-case calculation, maybe we're going to have methodologies that will be sector-specific over time so that these different calculations are less arbitrary and more standardized in that way. I'm purely speculating here, but,
Yeah, it's and help us out with, okay, so we calculate the Scope 4 value, I'll call it. Who gets it? Does this basically go into the reporting of the publicly traded insulation company that then the pension plan can read through the disclosure and say, oh, okay, so I can Scope 4 here, and then adds it to or subtracts it from their portfolio of scope calculations? Is that how it works?
So we actually have done a lot of work on this already because we at ARC are investing in energy transition opportunities, and we wanted to really understand better what the avoided emissions could be across different types of energy transition companies. So we stepped back and we did a lot of this work with Milani to understand what the avoided emissions case is for each of these energy transition areas. And then ultimately, when it comes to reporting, you're placing these avoided emissions alongside your scope 1, 2, and 3 calculations. So you can see, okay, this is an insulation manufacturer. I see it as high 1 and 2 emissions. Okay, it's got some scope 3, but here's what the scope 4 look like. Okay, I can get my head around that this is a transition asset. I can get comfortable with the fact that it has higher scope 1 and 2 emissions now. Maybe that'll decarbonize over time, but it fits in a transition portfolio. What we can't do, though, is add or subtract. In general, you're showing both of them alongside each other to give the full picture, but it can't be used to subtract and give a sort of net zero implication. To actually get to net zero by 2050, those scope 1 and 2 and 3 emissions have to come down.
All right. Well, I think I've learned a lot about scope 4. I mean, to be fair, I've learned a lot because of Marcus and Erica's work over the last many months on this. But I did want to say, there have been cases where people have been accused of greenwashing using this information. A very high-profile one was, I think, Mark Carney got himself into some trouble by saying that these avoided emissions or scope 4 emissions were offsetting his other emissions. Can you just explain that and maybe caution how people use these numbers?
Yeah, so this was Mark Carney in his role at Brookfield at a conference made the comment that Brookfield was a net zero asset manager because they did have some coal and oil investments, but they had a large renewables portfolio that had a big swath of avoided emissions that they could call themselves net zero. He subsequently had to walk that back because, as we've talked about, that doesn't really fit what people are describing as net zero. So as we're doing this work, we're certainly very careful not to say that it makes you a net zero company or investor. It's really more about understanding where your investment portfolio fits in the energy transition.
Well, we're going to wrap up here in a few minutes. I'm getting close to that. It's been a great conversation. But Erica, maybe you can tell us about Milani and its annual survey of investors on ESG.
Yeah, absolutely. So we started doing this semi-annual ESG sentiment study of institutional investors back in April 2020, so during COVID. And at the time, the goal was to understand, is COVID affecting the ESG movement? And we've been doing these studies now for the past 3 years, and it's been interesting to observe how these trends have been fluctuating. One of the key questions that we kept asking is, has the approach towards ESG changed for these investors? And it's been really interesting to see that through all the different market turbulences that we've been having over the past 3 years, the answer has always been no. And so I think this really speaks to the fact that ESG has been a long-term approach. And coming back to some of the comments we've had before between divestment or engagement, most of our investors are taking this position of engaging. And so whether the energy sector is fluctuating, the fact is that investors are behind them and they want to support them in this transition because the grander scheme of it is to contribute to climate change. And this is why I think it fits nicely with the idea to understand the contribution of, and I think that's where Scope 4 really plays an interesting added value here.
Well, if I may rack up on a few things here, I guess my view of this Scope 4 conversation is that there's no question we know behind the scenes in the financial industry this is a trend. I get it. I understand the motivations in terms of trying to get the capital to flow and to figure out this new carbon economy as we go forward. I must say that I am very concerned about the complexity of all this. Scope 3 wasn't enough. We've got to go to Scope 4. Take your insulation example. Okay, what if the insulation company puts solar panels on the roof? Is that Scope 5? But anyway, I guess that's the conversation topic for next time. And in the meantime, thank you very much, Erica Coulombe from Montreal at Milani. Really great to have you with us and keep up the good work, especially with our own Marcus Rock from ARC Financial. Thanks so much for all the work and the thought leadership that you've been doing with us. So with that, Jackie, I think it's time to say goodbye.
Yeah, and thanks to our listeners. If you enjoyed this podcast, please rate us on the app that you listen to and tell someone else about us.
For more ideas and insights, visit arcenergyinstitute.com.